Chapter 18. Miss Wycliffe gave every indication of being a Hogwarts student, yet her details were wildly off. She admitted to being a mudblood, even claimed to have received a letter. But letter or not, even a late letter, it was just not possible for a mudblood to attend Hogwarts, and hadn't been for a very long time. This could all be some sort of a weird trick. Severus needed to know more. Perhaps, if he gave her some information, he would learn more from her responses. Miss Wycliffe, Severus began after she finished most of her food, there seems to be considerable difference between your yesterday and my today. The girl looked up at him, waiting. She no longer seemed as fearful of him. Those people you mentioned, Severus continued, how to put it. I am familiar with their names, but I am afraid they are all dead. He watched as Miss Wycliffe's face turned very pale. All of them? She whispered in disbelief. Yes, he replied calmly. They've been dead for some time. That can't be, Miss Wycliffe said, trying to absorb the news. They were just... She began again. How? Tears streamed down her face, crying for people Severus knew to be long dead. Most of them died, he answered softly, remembering. Fighting a lost cause. Severus waited until the crying stopped. Then he conjured up a handkerchief and handed it to Miss Wycliffe to wipe her face. One could easily bewitch a person to believe something false, but to make her feel it, that required much more. Severus had had many years of experience with all sorts of magic, both light and dark. He was convinced that these tears came naturally, born from a continued association with these people. Yet that could not be possible. They were dead. Only one other person knew how much Lily Evans had meant to him, and that person, he knew, had told no one. Have you ever, Severus began as casually as he could, heard of the name Harry Potter? Yes, sir, Miss Wycliffe replied promptly. He's my cousin. Cousin? Had he heard her right? Severus gripped the armrest tightly with his hand in an effort to not betray the emotions he felt. Keeping his face totally blank and watching her closely, he softly asked, Did you say was or is? Is, of course, responded Miss Wycliffe easily. She, again, clearly had no concept of the importance of her words. He's the one who got me into Hogwarts, Miss Wycliffe continued. He took me to Diagon Alley to get my wand. He's my legal guardian while at Hogwarts. My parents don't like wizards and stuff too much. He's very famous in the wizard world, you know. Miss Wycliffe put down the handkerchief and returned to her eating, finishing the food on her plate. Severus just stared at her, thinking about her words and what they could mean. The details, always the details. That was what made her so convincing. He had visited the Dursley house once when Harry was little, had known the kind of people they were, seen their son. Son. Miss Wycliffe could not be a cousin, not with that surname. But I don't recall the name Wycliffe being connected with the Potter family, Severus replied cautiously. Miss Wycliffe put down her fork and looked up. No, she said reflectively, I don't suppose you would. I remember hearing they changed the name when the family went into hiding. I don't know what the original name was. That was all before Cousin Harry defeated Lord Voldemort, of course. Severus choked. He quickly began coughing to cover the choking, to cover the emotions he feared he would betray. Miss Wycliffe had spoken the name so fearlessly. She could not be part of any plot to upseat him. No one in this world would ever dare have her say such things. What was she? How had she come to exist? First things first. Miss Wycliffe, Severus said softly after clearing his throat, you would be wise to never mention that name aloud again. People who do tend to, he paused to further emphasize his next word, die. But I don't understand, Miss Wycliffe said confused. If he is dead, surely no one would mind if... Her green eyes grew very big as she suddenly realized what he was trying to say. He's not dead. Not here, is he? She whispered, looking very much afraid. No, Miss Wycliffe, he isn't, confirmed Severus. Miss Wycliffe buried her face in her hands. I don't understand, she sobbed. How could this be? What's happened? "I don't know," replied Severus honestly. For the first time he considered whether there might be more to Miss Wycliffe's words than fantasized ravings. She had clearly lived her life without the shadow of the Dark Lord. How could that be possible? Even Muggles feared that name today, those who knew it. Severus silently watched Miss Wycliffe cry while he considered this new angle. He closed his eyes, trying to think things through. If, as he was fairly certain, she had been untouched by magic and had been speaking the truth all along, then that would mean he had been the one bewitched. Severus doubted that. Had that been the case, he would never think such things. Besides, it would take considerable knowledge and magical powers to bewitch a whole world, changing it so drastically. No one could do that. What then? What? Miss Wycliffe's words interrupted Severus's thoughts. What happened to Cousin Harry? That was something he could answer, something he knew all too well. During his second year at Hogwarts, began Severus, something sinister called the Chamber of Secrets was opened. Harry Potter, along with 2 other students, Weasley children, if I recall right, vanished. They were never seen again and eventually presumed dead. There had been a fairly large ceremony in memory of the 2 Weasley children at the time. Nothing for Harry Potter. His aunt and uncle hadn't even mourned his passing. Harry Potter had merely become the boy who had lived. That had always been Severus's one regret, a failure to protect Lily's son. Aloud, Severus added, "The defense against the dark arts professor at the time was found later wandering the halls of Hogwarts with his mind so muddled that he was unable to tell what happened. He never recovered." "I don't know about any Chamber of Secrets," whispered Miss Wycliffe, wiping her green eyes dry. Her voice trembled ever so slightly as she looked at him. "But in the 4th year, Lord, you-know-who, used Cousin Harry somehow to get a new body. And 3 years later, Cousin Harry and, you-know-who, met in the Great Hall of Hogwarts to fight, and there's this big painting across from the Defense Against the Dark Arts room that shows it all," she concluded weakly, beginning to sob again. "But it's probably not there now, is it?" she said through her tears. She'd never even heard of the Chamber of Secrets. Was it that inconsequential? No one knew what happened that fateful night, but the mystery of the chamber nearly closed Hogwarts and remained a source of bedtime threats by parents everywhere. Was it possible Potter should have returned alive? Why hadn't he then? Severus's eyes opened wide in shock. A time reverse curse! Of course! Hinted at only in the darkest of magic books, a time reverse curse could supposedly guarantee a second chance in light of the unthinkable, a wizard's death. It provided the wizard an opportunity to go back in time to fix things. A time reverse curse worked similar in principle to a time turner. The Granger girl had used a time turner in her 3rd year to take additional classes. She drowned herself in work so she wouldn't have time to think about her grief at the loss of her friends. It may have succeeded, but by the end of the year, the long hours, sleepless nights, and little food had taken its toll. Hermione Granger had looked more like a skeletal walking zombie than the brilliant, vibrant student she had once been. She never recovered her original spark and vanished from school soon after. But a basic time turner could reverse time only so far, and a dead wizard could not operate it. A time reverse curse, on the other hand, used a cursed object instead of a live wizard. A single touch would cause the object to act as a limited time turner, automatically reversing time to a pre-designated moment while the wizard was still alive, presumably giving the wizard a second chance to work events in his favor, thus avoiding a future death. The curse was pure speculation, of course. What wizard truly contemplates failure and took the time to act on it? The problem was knowing which moment to use. A time reverse curse had to be set in advance, in anticipation of a possible future instance where something might go wrong. In addition, if the time reverse curse was activated, there had to be some way to inform the wizard who cast the curse of what originally occurred, so corrections could be made the next time around. Difficult, to say the least. Logistics aside, it was extremely dangerous to meddle with time. Usually wizards who did so ended up killing their past or future selves by mistake, or created such confusion that it required the whole Ministry of Magic to sort it out. Of course, those were the wizards who meddled with time that Severus knew about. Cast properly, any spell involving time should seamlessly override the original events, creating a new timeline. If a new timeline had been created by the time reverse curse, Severus would never know and should have never found out. Why, then, did he think of such things? Severus looked again at Miss Wycliffe, with her eyes so familiar, her fair skin, her blonde hair, and green eyes. She existed, yet she shouldn't, and she had never heard of the Chamber of Secrets. Someone had opened the Chamber of Secrets, had planned and carried out the abduction of Ginny Weasley that fateful night. The person was never found or identified. Was it possible that the same person could have planted a time-reverse curse as well? The curse, if there was one, was clearly quite powerful, brilliantly executed, and totally undetectable. Or, rather, it had been. If such a thing had occurred, how had Miss Wycliffe escaped such a powerful curse untouched? What made her so special? Severus could only think of one thing. Miss Wycliffe was related to the boy who had lived, or maybe the boy who should have lived. Severus knew Dumbledore had cast numerous powerful protective spells around Harry Potter in the hopes that Harry might live long enough to fulfill his prophecy. The very act of sheltering Harry put the lives of those who lived with him in danger, too. Might Dumbledore have cast similar spells of protection for Harry's only living relatives? If so, could the protective spells placed around the Dursleys been strong enough to resist the effects of a time-reverse curse as well? Perhaps. Slowly, Severus turned his head to look at a specific portrait on the wall. The people in the portraits were all leaning forward, listening to the exchange between Severus and Miss Wycliffe. They hastily sat back and tried to appear uninterested when Severus looked up. All, that is, except the portrait of Dumbledore. The Dark Lord had suggested destroying that particular portrait, as he had all the other portraits he found of Dumbledore. Severus argued that such a destruction would go against Hogwarts tradition, and so the portrait remained isolated in this room, all but forgotten. The person in the portrait rarely spoke these days, but now it looked upon him with earnest eyes. "Now is your chance to keep your promise, Severus," he implored. His very words seemed to answer all Severus's unasked questions. Miss Wycliffe looked up, surprised at the third voice in the room. She followed Severus's glance and also stared at the portrait on the wall. "But she saw my portrait," Severus protested softly. "What will happen to her if you don't?" the face in the portrait asked, looking over at Miss Wycliffe. Severus looked at the girl, the very image of Lily Evans. If she stayed, the Dark Lord would surely want her. Severus couldn't keep her safe. Dumbledore was right. He couldn't risk letting her down again. Severus sighed. "We, too, have a painting that commemorates past events," he said softly to Miss Wycliffe. "Would you like to see it?" "I guess so," she replied. "Then come with me, please." Severus stood up and held out his hand to her. She took the hand and followed him out the room. The two walked silently down the hall, each filled with their own thoughts. They reached the steps and started walking down. Most of the students were in class now. The few they passed were Slytherins patrolling the halls and watching the steps. They each came to attention when they saw the headmaster passing by. Though curious about the girl with him, none asked any questions. Finally, they reached the base of the grand steps. Severus led the girl to the end of the entryway, opposite the massive front doors. He stopped and turned around. Miss Wycliffe stopped too. Together the two looked at the painting. It was huge, covering the whole back wall. Drawn larger than life, it depicted 3 wizards standing upon high craggy cliffs. 2 wore black robes, and 1 was dressed in white. The imposing figure of the Dark Lord stood in the foreground, robed in black, his pale face flushed with victory, as he cast his final killing curse towards the figure in white, Albus Dumbledore. Dumbledore stood bravely, trying his best to block the curse. On the other side, also robed in black, stood a handsome younger wizard, His face displayed earnest concentration as he cast his spell on Dumbledore, also a killing curse. The two curses moved forward swiftly, striking Dumbledore at the same time, and he collapsed in death. The Dark Lord and the younger man stepped back and watched Dumbledore fall. Then they raised their wands in a salute to each other, the young man's eyes alight with success. A few seconds later, the scene repeated itself, with the two wizards again striking in sync, and Dumbledore collapsing in death. The painting displayed an impressive vision of victory and defeat. "I recognize this person," said Miss Wycliffe, pointing to the Dark Lord, but carefully not naming him. "He was in the painting with Cousin Harry, and this," she said, pointing to Dumbledore, "he was in the portrait in your office. But who is the other one?" Who indeed? Had she known, had she recognized him, Severus may have had to revise all his conclusions. "That is a person by the name of Tom Riddle," he said softly. Tom Riddle, the man of mystery. He was a young wizard exceptionally skilled in the dark arts. He suddenly appeared from nowhere to be the Dark Lord's most trusted, not a follower exactly, but more of an associate. Dumbledore seemed to know more than he ever let on about Tom Riddle, but that knowledge died with him. "Tom Riddle appeared approximately 2 years after young Potter died," continued Severus aloud. "Little is known of his origins or whereabouts before that time. He was instrumental in assisting the Dark Lord's rise to power. The Dark Lord seemed to trust him above all others. It took both of them working together to defeat Hogwarts headmaster Albus Dumbledore, considered by many to have been the greatest wizard of his time." Severus clearly remembered that day as if it were yesterday. Dumbledore had known he would be going to his death, yet he refused Severus's offer of help. He had insisted Severus continue his undercover role with the Dark Lord. He made Severus promise to become the next headmaster and to protect the students. That promise Severus had been able to keep. The Dark Lord had been pleased with Severus's services and happily granted his request. "After the death of Dumbledore," Severus continued softly, "resistance to the Dark Lord quickly ended. Those who continued to fight him died. After the resistance had collapsed, the Dark Lord ordered the destruction of Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, and Hufflepuff houses. It had been Severus's idea of having the sorting hat sort into 2 houses, the Slytherins and those who would not be sorted into Slytherin, the non-Slytherins. The decision had not been popular with the Death Eaters, but it had made possible for more students to attend Hogwarts. Severus hadn't been able to do anything for the mudbloods and half-breed students who, if they still lived, languished away in Azkaban prison. It had been Tom Riddle who suggested the huge room beneath Myrtle's bathroom as the dorms for the non-Slytherins. He never said how he knew of it. The location seemed to amuse both Tom and the Dark Lord, though they never explained why. Miss Wycliffe and Severus continued to watch the painting with its endless cycle of death and victory. "You're dead," said Miss Wycliffe suddenly. "What?" "Your portrait on the wall," explained Miss Wycliffe, looking up at him. "It means you died in my world, just like Dumbledore did." Severus turned away. "That is of no consequence," he replied. "It is to me," continued the girl earnestly. "How can I thank you for your help?" Severus looked down at Miss Wycliffe, her green eyes and the face he knew so well. He was touched by her simple faith that he would somehow make things right. "You already have," he said gently. He looked away. "We must be going," Severus said. He took her hand and led her off to the stairs. "You must love her very much to do this for me," spoke up Miss Wycliffe abruptly as they started up the steps. "What?" "Lily Evans," she replied softly. Surprised, Severus stopped and looked directly at Miss Wycliffe. "You block your emotions very well," she explained further. "Better than Professor Lovegood or Cousin Harry. But every time you look at me, I feel a bit of love. It can't be me that makes you feel that way. We've only just met, so it must be her you keep seeing when you look into my face." "I must learn to block my emotions better," Severus managed to choke out while sounding calm. A morning with Miss Wycliffe, and she'd already learned Severus's deepest secret, one that even the Dark Lord himself never suspected, and that was with him knowing she was an empath. The Dark Lord must never get his hands on her. He resumed walking with Miss Wycliffe by his side. I wish more people could block like you, said Miss Wycliffe ruefully. Sometimes I feel real sick to my stomach with all those different emotions coming at me from all sides. I expect that is difficult, Severus murmured. It is, agreed Holly. But Professor Lovegood says once I figure out blocking, everything will get better. She says it's just a matter of getting the dingle squirts out of the left side of my brain lined up with the plexial hookies on the right side. Professor Lovegood, thought Severus. Loony Lovegood? She hadn't made it past her 5th year at Hogwarts before Bellatrix, annoyed with an article in the Quibbler, had tortured and killed both her and her dad. They turned off the 3rd floor and started walking down the hall. Miss Wycliffe continued to chatter to Severus like he was an old friend. In all his years at Hogwarts, no one had ever talked to him like that. Everyone who's ever seen Lily says I look a lot like her, continued Miss Wycliffe. You do, thought Severus, but he didn't interrupt. It's no big deal at school, though, she added while they walked, except for Professor Slughorn. He keeps calling me Lily whenever I get a potion right. That's kind of annoying. Slughorn, remembered Severus silently. He'd gone into hiding after Dumbledore died. He'd probably be there still if Fenwick hadn't sniffed him out one day. Figuring anyone in hiding was no friend to the Dark Lord, Fenwick had decided to bite first, so to speak, and ask questions later. The resulting bloody mess found in the house made major headline Muggle news when the actual owners of the house returned from their holidays a week later. But it turned out to be a big deal at home, though, continued Miss Wycliffe. I guess Grandma hated her sister Lily, and when she saw me looking so much like her, well, she only got a quick glimpse, thank goodness. I had to cut my hair as a disguise. I had no idea she felt like that. Your grandmother, interrupted Severus, was a mean-spirited person who called Lily a freak just because she couldn't go to the same school together. Miss Wycliffe shut her mouth and blinked a few times at that. Forgive me, added Severus earnestly. That was terribly rude. That's okay, she said, acknowledging his apology. I expect Cousin Harry would have said the same thing, except he was trying to be polite. She is my grandmother, you know. But it has been a problem, my going to Hogwarts, you know. Grandmother doesn't know yet, you see, and we've had to go to all sorts of lengths to keep it from her. Your grandmother doesn't know you're attending Hogwarts? Asked Severus, amazed. No, continued Miss Wycliffe. Dad says he'll try to tell her this summer, but I don't know if he will. He's afraid she might split a gasket when she learns and never talk to us again. She might at that, agreed Severus, remembering that angry sister he had seen at the train station. Too bad I can't use my wand during the summer, laughed Miss Wycliffe. I might need it for protection should Grandma explode. Wand. Severus froze. I need to get something first, he said to Miss Wycliffe. He wheeled around, his emerald and green robes flowing, and headed the other direction. Come with me, he said urgently, and grabbing her hand, set off at a quick pace. The two raced down the halls. The classes had let out and there were students in the halls, but the students all stepped back and let the headmaster and his victim pass. The headmaster's wrath was well known. Some students gave Holly a pitying glance as she passed, but none dared question the authority of the headmaster. Back through the halls they went, and up the stairs, 4 flights. They moved down another hall until they were again facing the gargoyles that guarded the headmaster's office. Severus gave the password, and soon the two were again in his office. At this point, Severus released Holly's wrist. Using his wand, he moved the heavy desk, now cleared of breakfast food and dishes, to one side. Beneath the desk, a small rectangular segment of rug rose and floated in the air. It landed gently on the desk. Severus knelt and lifted a piece of polished floorboard up and set it aside, revealing a small hole beneath. He pointed the wand into the hole where it glowed brightly for a minute. Then he reached into the hole and lifted a small piece of paper in a skinny, long, rectangular box. He looked at the paper briefly, a photo of Lily, smiling happily, before tucking it into his robe. Then he brought the box to Holly. Puzzled, Holly took the box and lifted its lid. Inside lay a polished wand. It was honey-colored and seemed to glow in the flickering torchlight. This was your Aunt Lily's wand, Severus said softly. I want you to have it. Dumbledore found it after Lily died and had given it to him. Miss Wycliffe's eyes grew wide. Oh, no, she breathed, looking at it in wonder. I can't take this. It means too much to you." "Please," Severus said sincerely. "I won't be needing it. You might have use of it." Miss Wycliffe reached into the box and drew out the wand. She swished it gently. It gave off a soft stream of yellow-white sparks. Miss Wycliffe looked up at Severus. There were tears in her eyes. "Thank you so much, Headmaster Snape. I'll never forget you." She gave him a warm hug. Severus awkwardly enfolded her with his own arms. He was unused to such affection. "Ahem!" came a voice. Both Severus and Holly looked up towards the sound. The sound came from one of the portraits. A slender man with gray-black hair, thin black eyebrows, and a pointed beard peered out at them. "I hate to interrupt, Severus," the man in the portrait said in a high, reedy voice, "but the Dark Lord sent a message reminding you that he intends to inspect the school today, and he wants to be sure everything is ready for his arrival." "Thank you, Phineas," said Severus quietly. Phineas Nigelius Black, a Slytherin and past headmaster, was the only portrait that consented to talk to the Dark Lord and pass on messages. He did his job well. Severus looked down at Miss Wycliffe. "We need to get going," he said to her. Clutching the wand tightly, the girl, that looked so much like Lily, placed her free hand in his and looked up at his face. "I'm ready," she said calmly. "Let's go." Severus led her out the office and back down the halls. After they started down the halls, Miss Wycliffe asked, "Where are we going?" "To the trophy room," answered Severus as they continued walking. "There is something there I want you to see." "Oh?" "It's a small plaque bearing 3 names," he continued. "It's most unusual." "Why is it unusual?" "2 of the names on the plaque, though they attended Hogwarts at the same time," Severus began, "were from different years and would have had little reason to associate with each other." "And the third?" "The third seems to be the name of someone totally unrelated to the other 2. "That is odd," Miss Wycliffe agreed. They reached the 3rd floor and began walking down its halls. "The 3 names have absolutely no reason to be connected, yet they are there together on this plaque," Severus added. Miss Wycliffe listened silently while she walked along with him. Severus continued. "The first 2 names are Ginny Weasley and Harry Potter," he stated without emotion. Miss Wycliffe looked up at him, her green eyes very wide. "They got married," she whispered. "No," Severus corrected flatly. "They both died in the Chamber of Secrets." Miss Wycliffe did not argue. "And the third name?" she asked in a tiny voice. "That is the name of a person who stood by the side of the Dark Lord when the Dark Lord proclaimed his return 2 years after Potter and Weasley's death," replied Severus dryly. "That name is Tom Riddle." Miss Wycliffe's grip on his hand tightened while they walked, but she didn't speak. There was more, of course. It was only much later that Severus discovered the engraved trophy bearing Tom Riddle's name dating some 60 years earlier. Yet Tom Riddle, when he stood by the side of the Dark Lord, had looked like a young schoolboy not much older than 15 or 16 years. Nor did Tom seem to age as others did in all the years Severus had known him. The plaque with the 3 names had practically reeked of dark magic, but when Severus showed it to Dumbledore, the headmaster told Severus to leave it alone. When Severus mentioned the plaque to Tom Riddle, Tom had laughed and called it an unnecessary precaution that would bother no one. There was one other curious event. Severus remembered it well. One day the Dark Lord had called in Tom Riddle and suggested that, despite over 15 years of devoted service, Tom should seek his fortunes elsewhere. This event was curious in many ways. Usually, the Dark Lord merely killed those he no longer trusted and fed them to his snake Nagini. He didn't send them away. Curious still was how Tom Riddle had accepted the suggestion without argument and immediately left for the Americas. While they talked, the Dark Lord had lovingly stroked a small, thin book with a shabby black cover. Severus realized with a start that he had seen that particular book once before, in the hands of Ginny Weasley. She'd been writing in it once during potions, instead of taking notes. When caught in the act, the Weasley girl had hastily tucked the book back in her bag. What would the Dark Lord want with such a book? Severus could think of only 3 magicians capable of actually casting a time-reverse curse, the Dark Lord himself, but he had not yet risen when Harry Potter vanished, Albus Dumbledore, who would never cast such a curse, and maybe the relatively unknown but exceptionally gifted, mysterious Tom Riddle. "I was thinking," began Severus thoughtfully, "that since two of the people listed on the plaque subsequently went into the Chamber of Secrets, might not the third person have been there as well?" Miss Wycliffe's step slowed. "And perhaps," Severus continued speculatively, "something occurred in the chamber preventing Mr. Potter and Miss Weasley from returning from that chamber alive, as they should have." "Is this possible?" "Many terrible things can be attempted with dark magic, Miss Wycliffe," said Severus, evading her question. "Meddling with time is, perhaps, the most difficult to detect and the most dangerous." He looked down at the girl. "You claim to have woken up this morning to a world totally different from that which you remembered. Do you think it's possible?" Miss Wycliffe was silent as they finally entered the trophy room. It contained many cases filled with brightly glittering shields, badges, and trophies. "Headmaster?" asked Miss Wycliffe, stopping to look around the room. "Yes." "How does one undo something like this, something that happened so very long ago?" "I don't know how to undo something like this," Severus said softly, and releasing her hand. He put his hands on her shoulder and looked into that face and those beautiful green eyes one last time. "I am part of all this," he whispered. "It must be you that finds the way." Severus looked quickly away from her, afraid she might see the tears, afraid of what he must do next, afraid he wouldn't have the strength to do it. He stared blankly at the walls as if looking, but he already knew where it was. "Ah," he said, finally forcing his voice to sound cheerful. He released Miss Wycliffe and moved to one of the walls. "There it is. This is a plaque I wanted you to see." He reached out and, using his robe, rubbed away the dust and grime that covered it. "Come and tell me what you think." The girl moved forward to look. "Severus," she suddenly said. "What?" Severus looked over at Miss Wycliffe, surprised. "Albus Severus Potter," she explained while standing on her toes to look at the plaque. "I thought it was such a funny name at the time. But he named his son after you, didn't he? Albus Severus Potter has green eyes," she added, speaking more slowly now, distracted by the reflection of her own eyes in the mirror-like quality of the plaque. "Just like his dad." Miss Wycliffe's green eyes seemed to glow weirdly back at both of them. "Just like Lily," added Severus silently. He felt oddly comforted by that thought. He watched as Miss Wycliffe's free hand reached slowly up towards the plaque. "Good luck, Miss Wycliffe," he said aloud as she touched the silver heart. Miss Wycliffe's whole body began to fade, growing more and more transparent with every second. Then she vanished completely.